from the holidays. So it's good to see everybody. Yeah, if you're like me, I think I'll get this thing off my neck. It's like I'm catching up from the holiday weekend, so. So it's good to see everybody today. Well, I hope you had a good holiday. Anything eventful happened to anyone that you want to tell on TV? Oh yeah, I was thrown in jail Saturday night. Oh no, didn't know I was on TV. Got to think before you speak in this environment, I guess. I've heard of some funny stories too. Maybe I shouldn't relate, but it's like one person's in this classroom, the other's their ex-wife in another classroom, and they get to talking and this maybe sending a little code there and it causes problems. So, but at any rate, I digress. So I hope you're having a good day today. So it's sunshiny, but it's been cool. So we've had some cool weather, and but we are beginning week 15, and gosh, I hope I have enough for us to talk about today, because after Turkey Day, too much tryptophan, I guess, in that turkey. Thanks, I'll get it later. And that puts me to sleep, and I stay in a semi-comatose state through the holidays because I eat too much. Takes a lot of calories to digest all that food. I don't get enough exercise. So, you young people don't have that problem. Just us old guys. So, but welcome back to school. So this is week 15, and so we've been, in Unit 3. Next week will be your Unit 3 show-off opportunity, right? So instead of exam. Well, I don't want to call it a final exam. That sounds too terminal. Hopefully nothing's final here other than you will finish this course, but maybe I'll see you in another course. By the way, I have the privilege of teaching international economics. So, I mean, if you like this a little bit, you'll really enjoy international economics. So, would love to see you in that course. So anyway, but just because the course comes to some sort of conclusion and you get this letter grade, you'll be so surprised about how good it is, I'm sure, that you'll want to, if not take Dr. J for another class, you'll want to come by his office on occasion and just tell me how things are going. So I appreciate Glenn does that on occasion, so it's good. All right, so, okay, I guess I've stalled long enough. We need to do something today. So I thought we would start chapter 21 today. Okay, so we're leaping ahead. We will go back and pull some things out of our study of monopoly here in a little bit. Hope to get to that as it folds into chapter 21. And chapter 21, we look at antitrust policy and regulation. And there's not any math in this chapter. Right? There's nothing really analytical here. Most of this is factual. And I miss our pre-law student here today. Maybe he'll be here next time, and because I know this is right down his alley. But anyway, so I have posted for you the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to use today for chapter 21. So I thought we would proceed through those and talk again about antitrust. So that may sound like a boring topic of discussion. Antitrust, what is that? That can't be very exciting, but it turns out it's a very timely topic of conversation. CNBC and Fox Business and so forth. If you watch enough of that on a daily basis, you're going to hear about pending litigation and so forth between private entities and the federal government, namely the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, about whether certain companies are too large, and so by the fact of their existence, they present a threat to competition, the competition we want to foster in the marketplace, Or do companies, not because they're so large, but because, are there certain companies that behave in a certain way that's very anti-competitive? And both of those, to some degree, are what we'd call violations of antitrust, or potential violations of antitrust law, or at least a violation of the spirit of antitrust law. So I don't mean to speak in riddles here, so let's go back and talk about what I mean by antitrust and so forth. So a lot of what we're going to talk about here is the product, was a legacy of legislation that was initiated in about 1890. Now that was before I was born, so that was back there ways. And so we'll talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act and so forth, those acts that began in 1890. So let's see here. If we can go to the PowerPoint slides, Radar. Okay, so we're going to talk about antitrust laws, antitrust policy, issues and impacts. Let's see, that's not, maybe it'll be on up front too. I don't know what's happening there. Industrial regulation and social regulation. Now, I've kind of drawn a line in this chapter here. Social regulation, I'm not going to put on the exam. I may talk about it. I actually intend to talk about it, but by the way, while I'm thinking of it, I will allow you again. I kind of forget what I do in particular courses, but at least in this course, this time on exam 3, you can use 2 sheets of notes. Did I let y'all do that last time? You'd think I'd remember. I did? Okay, I thought I did, but 2 sheets of notes, write on them whatever you want, and you'll just kind of have to hold them up to the camera, so I don't know. Okay, when you start, but I would like for you to, use that optic nerve that runs from the eye to the hand to make your notes. I'd rather you didn't photocopy your book. And the reason why is because that nerve goes through your brain. So in the process of if you want to transcribe material from your text or what have you, you do process it mentally, whether you realize it or not. There have been studies about that. We won't go into that. But at any rate, I want to encourage you to fill up those 2 sheets, both sides, with content, especially from this part in Chapter 21 that I've outlined here will be on the Exam 3 for next week. And as I mentioned on that slide we just saw there, you need to know material down to, but not including, social regulation. So if we go back to chapter contents, boy, I sure hope our PowerPoint's working up front here today. Radar. So, okay, good. Thank you very much. She's great. All right, so the antitrust laws, antitrust policy, issues and impacts, and industrial regulation. So there's just some salient or conspicuous points that we'll encounter as we walk through this today that you want to make note of, and I could ask you about on the test next week. Now Thursday, by the way, before we launch into this much, I want to just say that Thursday what I would like to do is wrap up a review of material in Unit 3 so you'll feel good about our test next week. So, okay, so again, a lot of what we'll talk about here today is the kind of the history of the United States and the business sector or business environment beginning in 1890. So first antitrust law was passed in 1890 by Congress. And then we'll talk about antitrust policy, issues and impacts, industrial regulation. You're going to see a lot of this, these are things you've read about in the press or encountered perhaps. If you have a job of any sort, you may have encountered some industrial regulation like OSHA. How many people have heard of OSHA? Okay, Occupational Safety and Health Administrator. That's right. Yeah, so it's OSHA that tries to keep us safe on the job and so forth. So that's going to be in the realm of industrial regulation. And then we'll get to social regulation perhaps later, okay? So actually OSHA is in the realm of social regulation, but that's okay. We'll get more precise here in a minute. So anyway, antitrust policy and regulations. I want to go to these slides here. This slide right here, the Sherman Act of 1890. That's the first bit of legislation you need to know about. This was passed just after the after the Civil War. It was passed in 1890. The Civil War drew up in April, at least the Treaty at Appomattox is April 1865. But at any rate, in the wake of the Civil War, the United States, once we were all on the same side again, both the great minds of the South as well as the North, we began to turn our attention toward taming the wilderness. There was the Transcontinental Railway that had been completed in 1863, I think, and so forth. But you had a lot of these businesses that had been channeled, on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, both North and South, had been channeled toward winning the war. We're now working together. And you had increases in transportation with the railroads. You had increases in efficiency in manufacturing and so forth. These were things that had been marshaled before to win war, were now being employed by visionaries, if you will, to produce profits and generate income and revenue for stockholders and so forth. So you had the rise of the robber baron. We called them the robber baron and so forth. So most notably, I mean, there were several of these. Cornelius Vanderbilt with railroads, Jay Gould with telegraph. You had Andrew Carnegie with steel. These are people you've read about in your American history course back in high school. But you had John D. Rockefeller in oil, right? You had Standard Oil. And these were all considered at the time under the label trust. Okay, the term was trust. The trust is kind of like a holding company, but you had big monopolies, perhaps several companies that colluded together under a board, some sort of ownership. These titans of industry would control these several companies, and they were engaged in the activity of fixing prices, dividing up markets, and so forth, and basically keeping out potential entrants in their industry. So again, for instance, you had John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil, and even before the rise of the automobile, everybody needed some oil. Okay, before there was an automobile, what would you need oil for? You need kerosene for heat your house, that's right, for your lamps. Call it coal oil and so forth. Everybody had a 5-gallon red bucket in their house, barrel basically, that Standard Oil would keep filled for you and so forth. They had a monopoly on the production of kerosene for homes and so forth. And it's just one instance, one example of where this company became so huge and so forth. And then certainly with the rise of the machine, not just the automobile, but before then, the internal combustion machine, even the steam engine before it, there was a need for petroleum and so forth. So we know here in Oklahoma, gosh, we have a whole history here of being on the forefront of petroleum exploration and recovery from the ground and so forth. So at any rate, okay, all that's to say the Sherman Act came along in 1890, was passed by Congress, and it was passed because of all these anti-competitive behavior that was being advanced by these, what we call today, titans of industry. Some people would call them robber barons. Was J.P. Morgan a robber baron, or was he a titan of industry, and so forth? Well, it just depends on what part of their life you're looking at and so forth. Andrew Carnegie, certainly, right? He did a lot of good at some point beyond the point in his life when he realized that getting rich isn't what life is all about. And so he got rich the first half of his life, and then the next half of his life he was active divesting himself of his riches. And so we have Carnegie Libraries, we have Carnegie Hall in New York, and we have Carnegie Mellon University, and all these philanthropic things that not only did he do, but others of your, again, robber barons, if you will, kind of embarked on because they realized, again, You can get rich and you can get filthy rich, but it's not any better to get filthy rich than just rich. Do something with your riches. Enough of that, I guess, but the Sherman Act came along to tame the titans of industry and for the behavior that they were engaged in. So you have the Sherman Act of 1890. I think I have do I have it here? Gosh, I guess I'll have to go to the document camera here, Radar. I'm sorry, I thought I had a slide on the Sherman Act. So if we could, there are two sections we want to look at. This is the first piece of legislation that reined in antitrust activity. First off, okay, so this was passed in 1890. I will say, as I think she's going to the document camera. Yeah, document camera on this. The Sherman Act was first kind of, and just disregard some of my writing here, sorry about that, but the Sherman Act was initially, or at first, kind of used against big labor, not against big business, but against big labor. There are two sections of the Sherman Act, passed in 1890. By the way, I think this is John Sherman, U.S. Senator from Ohio, who was the younger brother of General William Tecumseh Sherman. Y'all have heard of William Tecumseh Sherman? Okay. He was a great Civil War general, and then he was an Indian fighter in the West, but he was next to Grant, the greatest general in the North. So John Sherman's younger brother advanced this in 1890, and here are the two sections. First section, every contract, combination in the form of a trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is declared to be illegal. Key word here is restraint of trade. Okay, that's a key thing there. Any combination that's been formed with the intent of restraining trade will be hereafter declared illegal. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or conspire with any person or persons to monopolize, what's a bad word there? It's monopoly, right? Monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. Actually, the word felony was not in the original act. I believe it came along. I wrote myself a note this morning when I went back through this. But in 1976, up until that point, this behavior was considered to be a misdemeanor. But to form a monopoly, just to form a monopoly, attempt to monopolize any part of an industry was considered to be a felony at this time. So what kind of restraints of trade are we talking about here in Section 1 of the Sherman Act of 1890? Well, things like collusive price fixing, dividing up the market, and monopolization. And like I said, the very first cases, believe it or not, that were prosecuted by the federal government under the Sherman Act, and would have been the Department of Justice then. We didn't have the Federal Trade Commission yet, but was against labor. But the very first one against business was against the Northern Securities Company, and this was during the Roosevelt administration. So, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, and I remember learning this back in school, when he took office in 1901, he immediately, even though he was a Republican, you think of Republicans generally as being pro-big business, even back in that day. He was known as the trust buster. Have you ever heard that term for Teddy Roosevelt? He was known as the trust buster. I remember learning that back in school. And what was the idea there? Well, with the trust buster, he was beginning with about his second month in office. He was bent on busting up the big companies, these big holding companies that were called trusts then. He was bent on breaking those up because he thought they were engaged in behavior that was inimical to the average consumer out there. All the price fixing, the collusion, the dividing up of the market, all these restraints of trade were not being performed with the consumer's best interest in mind. So the very first company he went after was the Northern Securities Company. And the Northern Securities Company, your book doesn't talk about this, so just something to kind of remember, was basically held a bunch of railroads. So you had Burlington Northern, you had, I don't know, a lot of these other railroads that are called Northern, like Northern Pacific and so forth. I don't know if those were companies that were kind of held by this holding company, this trust, and they were engaged in basically price fixing. So, in restraints of trade. So, you know, if you were a manufacturer and you wanted to ship your goods to market, you had these different railroads to choose from. Guess what? They were all ultimately owned by the same person. So you had to pay these high prices and so forth. And there were instances where the tracks were all parallel. And so, you know, it would have been nice at the time if different companies owned different tracks so that they could compete with each other. But up to this point, there was no law that said that could not happen. So Roosevelt was successful in breaking up the Northern Securities Company. Maybe that's a good thing to remember. That was the very first successful act under the Sherman Act of breaking up a company because it was in fact a monopoly. The second one, your book I think obviously would have to talk about this, is a Standard Oil Company, okay? So Standard Oil was owned by John D. Rockefeller, huge company, and he was, in his day, and perhaps in the history of the modern West, he's the richest man that ever lived since King Solomon, I guess. Today, and I don't know, I would imagine Elon Musk is wealthier than he is. Now you got to realize a dollar today isn't the same as a dollar 125 years ago or so. But if you were to express his wealth, John D. Rockefeller's wealth in today's dollars, you would realize that perhaps he has more dollars in the bank or more nominal wealth than does even Elon Musk. So John D. Rockefeller owned pretty much Standard Oil. And this was the second company, basically, that Teddy Roosevelt went after under the Sherman Act and successfully broke up. In the wake of Standard Oil, we had several companies whose names you would recognize today. Okay, ExxonMobil was one. ExxonMobil came from, I believe it was Standard Oil of New Jersey. So when they broke it up, Standard Oil of New Jersey was ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of California ultimately became Chevron. Standard Oil of Ohio was purchased by BP Petroleum, so it's actually was acquired by BP Petroleum. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, which ultimately became part of BP. But we've heard of those names, right? And believe it or not, all of those companies are children of, if you will, Standard Oil, the Standard Oil Company that John D. Rockefeller pretty much owned in his day. So that's the Sherman Act of 1890. We'd like for you to know that it was the first major piece of legislation that was aimed at monopoly existence and behavior. The key words in the first section are restraint of trade. Okay, we'll come back to that here in a second. The second one was that the attempt to monopolize a market was considered to be illegal. Now, the second act was the Clayton Act of 1914, that it gave some teeth to the Sherman Act. And there are several provisions of the Clayton Act, but these are the most important, these four. Section 2 outlaws price discrimination. That's the thing to remember there. So, you know, under the normal situation, normal circumstance of doing business, a supplier or seller can't charge one person a price different than another, at least overtly and in large scale. Now, your movie theater does it all the time. They have adult tickets, they have children's tickets. Airlines do it all the time with business class and, you know, private and so forth. But what they call it, coach, right? Business and coach, isn't that right? and so forth. So you have forms of price discrimination that do exist, even with the grocery store. They may print coupons in the newspaper. So if you clip the coupons, you get a cheaper price. And so they figure that people who are willing to spend the time to clip a coupon perhaps can't afford that gray poupon that's on the shelf, but alas, they have a coupon to purchase the poupon. Okay? So at any rate, those are forms of price discrimination in a way, but it would be illegal for a large manufacturer to charge one customer a different price than another for the product that they produce. So this is called price discrimination. It's outlawed by Section 2 of the Clayton Act. Tying contracts, okay, in which a producer requires that a buyer purchase another or other of its products as condition for obtaining a desired product. Okay, so you can't say, oh, if you buy this printer, you have to buy this ink cartridge to go with your printer. If somebody else makes a printer, an ink cartridge that's compatible with your printer, then you can't forbid them from purchasing the ink cartridge. In other words, companies have to be open to innovation and competition. So you make something like that, you have to be open to other suppliers providing a good that is compatible with whatever the product is that you're manufacturing. That's just one example of what would be considered to be a tying contract. There are others that are more formal in the supply chain and so forth. I'll just say your book doesn't go into any of this really. But you should know that tying contracts are illegal by the Clayton Act, and this is the tying contracts, forbidding tying contracts and forbidding price discrimination are areas of active involvement by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice today in the whole antitrust world. Okay, they do this, okay? They prosecute people for violating these things. Section 7 prohibits the acquisition of stocks of competing corporations when the outcome would be less competitive. So if you sat on the board of one auto company, automobile manufacturer, you can't sit on the board of another, okay? In fact, that kind of is in Section 8 as well. It's Section 7 talks about the acquisition of stocks. Section 8 talks about interlocking directories. So in either case, okay, one company can't just overtly begin purchasing the stock in another company with the intent of shutting down competition. Now, we have mergers, what are called horizontal mergers that occur quite frequently, but the federal government looks at those, and there's a different test, there are different ways they have of scrutinizing those proposals to determine whether or not they should be challenged or not. But the Clayton Act gives the federal government, if you will, the right to challenge horizontal mergers between companies that are kind of engaged in the same industry. So, as far as one company purchasing the stock of a competitor corporation, that is forbidden by the Clayton Act of 1914. Interlocking directories as well. Again, if you sit on the board of General Motors, you cannot sit on the board of Ford Motors and so forth. So these are provisions of the Clayton Act of 1914. The third act, there's 4 of these that are major acts, okay? So that was the second one. The third act is the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 that established the Federal Trade Commission, which is a 5-member commission that primarily looks at proposed mergers and so forth. So the FTC Act brought about ultimately a body that has prosecutorial powers along with the Department of Justice. Those are the 2 arms of the federal government that will get in the way of 2 companies merging or coming together, that will prosecute antitrust behavior, any attempt to collude. One provision of Congress, that is a piece of legislation of Congress, that gave teeth to the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 was the Wheeler-Lee Act of 1938, okay? The Wheeler-Lee Act of 1938 forbid deceptive acts or practices in commerce. In other words, false advertising, okay? Deceptive advertising. So if you claim that, in fact, your book mentions the case against Volkswagen in 2016, and this was also prosecuted in the EU as well, but Volkswagen claimed that its automobiles were near pollution-free when they made all these extravagant claims about how green their vehicles were when in fact they were not, and they were successfully prosecuted by the federal government under the Wheeler-Lee Act. Right now, what's pending, I heard something about this the other day, but because I've been thinking about buying a Tesla. I don't know if I should mortgage my house to buy a Tesla or not. Those things are expensive. I'm being a little facetious there, but you know, someone told me the other day, I talked to Tesla owners, and they say, oh, you have trouble holding the road very long, and I do. I commute back and forth to Muskogee, which is a pretty good little drive, and sometimes I want to nod off. I always get a nap before I hit the road if I can. But, you know, if you had a self-driving car, if I only had a self-driving car, I could probably take a nap on my way home if I had to. I don't know. I'm not quite there yet, but at least it's another layer of security. Well, Tesla's made these claims that for $15,000 you can get the self-driving package. And I'm just speaking in general terms, okay? I think it's like $15,000 or something. But now, does the self-driving package really, is it foolproof? I mean, this is something you want to be 100%, not 99% effective, but 100% effective when you're on your commute home, right? You don't want to be 99% safe. You don't want to get home 99 out of 100 times safely. You want to get home 100 out of 100 times. So actually, this claim by Tesla is being scrutinized as we speak by the federal government. So these are claims that companies may make, and the government says not so fast. And if you go to the air with that claim, we may fine you under the Wheeler-Lee Act of 1938. Okay, so that's the third piece of legislation. Okay, I would like for you to know about. Might make a note of that on your exam sheet or what have you. Again, you have 2 pages of notes that you can use, so make note of that. The Seller-Kefauver Act. Have you ever heard of Estes Kefauver? Ran for president and so forth. This was the act of 1950. It amended the Clayton Acts. Now, the Clayton Acts forbid interlocking directories. It forbid one company from acquiring the stock in a competitor company. But a workaround this, a loophole, if you will, that remained from the Clayton Act was that it didn't really forbid one company from not acquiring the stock in a competitor, but from acquiring the assets of a competitor. In other words, buying the machinery and so forth, the physical assets of a company. So the Seller-Kefauver Act closed that loophole, if you will, and made it illegal for one firm to obtain another firm's physical assets when the effect would be reduced competition. Okay, so if you've got De Beers out there, now we don't have that in the United States, that's a monopoly and was in Africa and so forth, but you got a mining company in the United States and there's another mining company, and one mining company wants to simply shut down another mine that's competing against it. It can't simply do that by purchasing that asset simply to shut it down. Okay, now again, these are, to some extent, these are hard, fast laws, but I say they're written that way, but they are to some extent guidelines for prosecution by the federal government. So what I'm saying here is that antitrust litigation has kind of moved back and forth a little bit. Initially, the policy of Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft, those very first presidents, were that big is bad. If you were big, you were bad. Okay, and that was kind of the prevailing view at the Supreme Court until the Standard Oil case. The Standard Oil case, the Supreme Court by 5-4 decision broke up Standard Oil. 5-4, that's pretty narrow, right? They broke up Standard Oil, but they issued kind of this caveat. They said they applied what was called the rule of reason. And this is what was going to be in effect going forward. At least that was what was published at the time. The rule of reason was simply this, that unreasonable restraints of trade would be looked on unfavorably by the court. To do some, okay, now you may say, what does that mean? And that had to be resolved and still is being resolved to this day. But the words were only unreasonable restraints of trade are forbidden by the Sherman Act of 1890. And so you're going to see, if you read the history of antitrust cases in the United States, while Standard Oil was considered to be in violation of Section 2 of the Sherman Act, along came the U.S. Steel case. I think your book talks about it somewhere here. I forget exactly when the U.S. Steel case was. U.S. Steel came along, Andrew Carnegie, and it was big too. It was a big company like Standard Oil. But the federal government tried to break it up. The Supreme Court did not let that happen. So big can be bad in some cases, but not in all cases. In the Standard Oil, in the U.S., did I say U.S. Steel? Yeah, in the U.S. Steel case, U.S. Steel was allowed to remain as a huge behemoth. It was a monopoly. There's no doubt about it at the time. There were other steel companies, but U.S. Steel was the big steel company at the time. But the Supreme Court said it had not acted in an unreasonable way, to restrain trade, free trade. So this is called the rule of reason that they tried to apply, and it might seem that in their application going forward of the rule of reason that there was maybe a little bit of a schizophrenic policy by our courts. Because you're going to see as we go forward, sometimes big looks bad, sometimes big isn't bad. So big was bad with Standard Oil, big was bad with the Northern Securities Company, big was not bad with U.S. Steel. But the rule of reason is the rule stated, and now your book says it was stated in the U.S. Steel case, okay? But it was actually, as my recollection recalls it, it was initially enunciated, if you will, in the decision of the Standard Oil case. But the rule stated that only combinations and contracts unreasonably restraining trade are subject to actions under antitrust laws, and that size and possession of monopoly power are not by themselves illegal. They are not per se violations. Okay, so you know what a per se violation is. Per se, P-E-R-S-E, violation. Per se violations are violations, they're recognized as violations if they exist at all, like price discrimination, okay, and tying contracts. Those have been considered per se violations of antitrust law. If you're engaged in price fixing, okay, let me say, instead of discrimination, I want to be careful there, price fixing. If you're fixing prices here and there to keep out competitors and so forth, you know, I'm going to price low over here so nobody can compete with me, or put somebody else out of business, and then I'm going to raise the price. If those sorts of behavior are per se violations of antitrust behavior and considered to be illegal. Now, when it comes to simply being something, not doing something, okay, those things, again, that companies do sometimes will be per se violations, maybe. But just being big in itself, the court said, is not illegal. So in the U.S. Steel case, U.S. Steel, even though it was considered at the time to be too big, needs to be broken up. The Supreme Court said, no, it's okay. It's not acting in an anti-competitive way. But along came Alcoa in 1945, okay? Alcoa Aluminum Company of America, and there's other aluminum companies like Alcan in Canada and so forth, but Aluminum Company of America in 1945 was broken up. Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America, had the monopoly on, your book says aluminum ingot manufacturing, but basically also on bauxite reserves in the United States, so aluminum oxide. So they were the kingpins and providing aluminum ingots to manufacturers and so forth. So, today, if an engine may have aluminum parts as well as steel parts and so forth. It's certainly an airplane's going to have an aluminum hull and so forth. If you want something light and malleable but somewhat strong structurally, you want aluminum. Alcoa had all that wrapped up. They were big. And it was more because, again, they were large, that the federal government said, hey, you're in violation of the Sherman Act. So the pendulum has swung back and forth. So you began over here with Northern Securities and Standard Oil, big is bad. You come over to U.S. Steel, big is not so bad. You come back over here to Alcoa, big is bad again. Okay, big is bad. So there has been a pendulum. A lot of times it depends on who the president is. Okay, because the prosecution, whether it's the DOJ or the Federal Trade Commission, is in the executive branch of the government for the most part. It's the executive branch that presses charges for the most part against these companies. So sometimes a president will be more friendly to big business, if you will, than in others. Actually, if you carry this forward, and there's some other cases we will look at here in a minute, I suppose, but in the 1970s, have you ever heard of Robert Bork? Okay, has anyone ever heard Robert Bork? It became a verb to say you've been borked. If you go before the Senate to be confirmed to the Supreme Court and you're treated in something of an unfair way, because this man was a candidate to sit on the Supreme Court, was a nominee, and he ultimately fell short during the Reagan administration, if I remember right. But before then, he was Solicitor General of the United States. He was the one who would bring cases on behalf of the Department of Justice and so forth before the Supreme Court. That's the Solicitor General, by the way, okay? So he was Solicitor General of the Supreme Court, and he wrote a book called, as I recall, it's called The Regulatory Paradox. And basically in that book he said, big is not only not bad, actually big is good. And he made the case in that book that big companies are what's making America great. In fact, it's big companies that increase consumer welfare. If it weren't for big companies, consumers would be worse off than better off. Can you think of any instances like that? I think of Walmart, okay? Now, a lot of us kind of decried the demise of the corner druggist, the small meat shop downtown, the hardware store, the flower shop. These things you used to see downtown, they're gone. Why? Because there's Walmart on the edge of town, right? Walmart, though, has been able to provide goods and services, primarily goods, to the consumer at a lot cheaper price than all these mom and pop stores used to. So in a way, the consumer's a lot better off. And without getting too deep into that argument, is America better off because of Walmart? But Robert Bork would have said, yeah, America is a lot better off because there are these big companies, big box retail companies like Walmart. And so quit trying to break them up. In fact, we have previously looked at a microeconomic argument for why big is good. You remember anything we've talked about in this course? Why is it maybe good for the consumer to allow a company, say a manufacturer, to get large? There's a term we used, economies of, you remember? Economies of scale. We were talking about economies of scale, where it says that You know, a larger company can produce a unit of output at a lower average total cost. It's why you have only 2 aircraft manufacturers of very large size in the world, Boeing and Airbus. I keep using that example, I know. But in automobile manufacturing and petroleum refining and so forth, it's better to be big than to be small. Because you got to be big, you got to have robotics, you got to have all of these things in place that require fixed cost before you can even build the very first unit, before you can build that first 777. You got to be big to do that. So if we had the federal government looking over the shoulder of Boeing incessantly saying, hey, you're getting too big, we probably would not have the airliners that we have. That was the argument of Robert Bork. So I don't know, he was an interesting fellow, but he ultimately fell short of sitting on the Supreme Court. At any rate, I digress a little bit, but hopefully these are things that might stick in your mind and you might want to Google. There's another one. Okay? Google. I know this is week 15, so I'm kind of let loose here today, talking about different things in this chapter that perhaps not as much structure. But the word Google in itself kind of points out this problem. Google is a company, right? It's a big company. Right now, the federal government's looking at Google and saying, you got a monopoly. Almost all of if you're going to search on Google, if you're going to search on the internet for something, the search engine of choice, is that the term, is what? Google. They say it's 99%. There is DuckDuckGo. Okay, I've never used it. Has anyone used DuckDuckGo? And there's Yahoo and so forth. But my understanding is 99% of the searches on the internet are with Google. And so if you want to know something, what are you going to do? You're going to Google it. So it's become a verb. Not only is it a noun, it's a verb, right? It's come into our common parlance. Oh, why? Because it's so ubiquitous today. Google. Okay, think about that. Have you thought about that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Everybody goes to Google to find something out. So you want to buy a new jungle gym for your kids. I'm going to go Google. Or you might go to Amazon. Same thing with Amazon, by the way. A lot of the retail is on Amazon. It's kind of been siphoned away from Walmart and so forth. But you got these big companies. Certainly Google. So you might, a particular item you're shopping for, you might Google it. Google. And when you do, the search engine is going to send you to certain suppliers, the ones it selects. And so you got this whole monopoly power here that's vested in this company that's a gateway of information transfer, Google. So right now there's a lot going on with Google. There's back before this in the 1990s, it was Microsoft. Microsoft primarily, I don't know too much about the history of this and just kind of go in different directions here, but it came about because it had the operating system on PCs, right? That's where Bill Gates got wealthy, is he owned the operating system on PCs for a long time. IBM didn't see that one coming. And so at any rate, Microsoft was able to, because it was the operating system on so many PCs, it was able to bundle with that operating system Internet Explorer. What was it called back then? I forget what it was called. Today it's called IEP, Internet Explorer. There's another term, I can't think of it. But there were other browsers that were competing with Internet Explorer. I forget what it was called then at the time, but they couldn't get in a piece of the action because every PC had Microsoft operating system, and every operating system had, as part of its functionality, had Internet Explorer and so forth. I guess you had Netscape or what have you. There were other browsers. I can't think what they were. But so, again, the federal government looked at that and said, hey, you possess too much power. Microsoft, you possess too much power. You're acting like a monopoly. Google is doing that today. If Google doesn't want to advertise your good, they don't have to. Back then, Microsoft, if they didn't want their search engine to go to your product, I guess they could keep you out. Now, they don't overtly do this, but their algorithms can exclude potential suppliers and so forth. So these are anti-competitive behaviors. In the Microsoft case, the federal government in a lower court was at the appellate level was given authority to break up Microsoft. But at the Supreme Court, I believe it was the Supreme Court, said, no, you don't break up Microsoft, but let's encourage them to change their behavior. And so they kind of had to open up some of their code and so forth. So now, when I get my computer and I click, I need to search on something, I said Internet Explorer. I get these mixed up. It's Chrome that's Microsoft, right? Y'all know? Isn't Chrome Microsoft? Okay. But I see also Internet Explorer, which is a child of previous one. I guess this morning I probably should have looked that up. I didn't. But at any rate, there are competing browsers on my desktop that were not there previously in the 1990s when I bought a PC. It had Microsoft operating system. It had only one browser there that I had to use. Okay, so I'll probably reveal a little of my ignorance there, so sorry about that. Go back and look at the Microsoft case if you'd like. Again, there have been different philosophies about whether big is good or not. Okay, and we're certainly entering an era here where big can be threatening to our way of life because, again, if Google's the only conduit of information out there using their algorithms or what have you, they can shut down what you might want to see and what you might want to learn. I like this case, the DuPont cellophane case. Read about this on page 433 of your text. Department of Justice brought suit against DuPont shortly after, I guess, they had invented cellophane. And the DOJ said that they had a monopoly on cellophane. I guess even after some of the patents expired and so forth, I don't know the exact thing, it had controlled at the time 100% of the cellophane market. So the DOJ said, that's not a good thing. Well, DuPont countered and said, you know what? If you want to pack your lunch for the day, you can wrap your sandwiches in cellophane if you want, but you don't have to use cellophane. You can use aluminum foil. In fact, there's lots of other, quote, the term was flexible packaging materials you can use, maybe paper, I don't know, other than cellophane. So yes, we have the patents on cellophane and so forth, but you don't have to use cellophane to pack your lunch. So when DuPont countered with that, then the courts recognized that actually DuPont was operating in a lot broader market than just the cellophane market. Okay? And they were competing with people who produced aluminum and so forth for the same service. And so the Supreme Court said, DuPont, though they're the, I guess, monopoly on cellophane, they're not acting in a monopolistic way. Okay, so there was no, certainly, per se violation of antitrust there, simply because they're big or they have patents for a particular good. You don't have to use their good to achieve whatever it is you want to achieve, to wrap your sandwiches for lunch. So DuPont survived that case in 1956, else they would have probably been broken up. So, you know, it depends on the administration in office. I mentioned Robert Bork just a moment ago. That was during the Reagan administration when he was Solicitor General. I think he was Solicitor General actually under Gerald Ford, come to think of it. But he was nominated to the court under the Reagan administration. But you had kind of the rise of the Republican Party in the executive branch. I mean, even though Nixon had been in there for 8 years almost, you had a recognition that big business could be a good thing. I'll come back to Nixon in a minute when we talk about social regulation. If we get there, we got one of the biggest social regulatory bodies in existence, the EPA, that was created in the Nixon administration. Okay, so I would like for you to read about some of these cases, at any rate, that they mention in chapter 21. Then they talk about the different mergers and divestitures that have occurred, like the AT&T case was a divestiture, if you will. I recall this. I'm old enough to remember this, but there was really, in my youth, only one telephone company. Only one telephone company, AT&T. And back then, in that day, you realized that if you wanted to make a long distance call, you had to pay more money. That was like an extra thing. Now we don't think about it, right? Pick up your cell phone, you call your Aunt Martha in upstate New York, it's not necessarily going to cost you more. This is because of innovation that has come about because of the breakup of AT&T in the 1970s. So you had one company, and because of its size and so forth, the federal government said that it was stifling competition. And that company, AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, was forced, it was prosecuted by the federal government, ultimately forced by the courts to break up into a bunch of smaller companies. So there was still the parent company, AT&T, and there was some 26 or 27 what were called baby bells. Have you heard that term? Baby. So you had Ma Bell, AT&T, and you had all these baby bells. So here we had Southwestern Bell. So remember, local calls you made through Southwestern Bell. Long distance calls still were carried through AT&T for a while, okay? And then there was still some further litigation that said, oh, these other carriers need to get a piece of the action too. So now, I'll just say it's become a much more competitive environment because of even the breakup of those. I guess your book says 22, I just noticed here, 22 regional telephone operating companies. So you don't hear so much about Southwestern Bell anymore, but you do hear about Verizon and so forth. These are companies that came about because of technology that was encouraged because other people could get in a piece of the action in telecom. Okay, and so there was the rise of new ways of communicating, new ways of transmitting the telephone signal with microwaves and so forth. Don't know much about that because I'm not an electrical engineer, so forth. But because of technology, we have all these other companies now that you can contract with your cell phone, and they provide all of your phone service. So we don't even think about it much today, do we? So I got my Cricket here. It's called, it's a company which isn't that with AT&T, and that I think a stepchild of that company still. But you may have another carrier. All these carriers have come about because ultimately AT&T was broken up in I guess it was in 1982. I said 1970s, but I guess I see here 1982. You have, again, antitrust. Big is bad, big is good. It just depends on where you are, who's in office, and so forth. So the federal government allows mergers on occasion to occur because big can be a good thing, and at least in the executive branch's mind. So we have seen horizontal mergers in particular, which in certain times has been considered to be inimical or bad for competition. And then you have vertical and you have conglomerate mergers. Those are the three types of mergers your book talks about. So I'd like for us to look at that here just a little bit today. Mergers, the whole concept of mergers. There are three types of mergers. There's a little schematic given in your book, and I guess I'll use the document camera. Thank you, Radar. So, okay, so that's visible up here. So it kind of talks about automobiles and blue jeans here, and it illustrates the three different types of mergers. A horizontal merger, these are the kind of mergers the federal government will be most concerned about, horizontal mergers. So, this would be like two oil companies merging. So I mentioned Exxon and Mobil a while ago, so being ultimately a product of the breakup of Standard Oil as a merger of two companies, two large oil companies that were in the same industry and so forth. Heinz purchased Kraft. Walt Disney purchased 21st Century Fox, was another example of a horizontal. Both are, kind of in the entertainment industry, Walt Disney and Fox and so forth. The federal government's concerned about horizontal mergers. Why would the federal government be more concerned about this kind of merger than these others, like a vertical merger where you're merging firms that are in the supply chain, different stages of the supply chain, or conglomerate mergers where you're merging two companies want to come together to take advantages of economies of scale and efficiencies, things called economies of scope and so forth. Conglomerate mergers are mergers between companies in differing industries. So this is the one I say that the federal government will give the most scrutiny to before they'll allow this to happen. Like, for instance, when there was the AT&T Time Warner merger back in the 17 or something like that. I lose track of time. There was a merger there. Ultimately, AT&T spun off Time Warner, and Time Warner merged with Discovery, if I remember right. So that's kind of what you got. Time Warner, or you have Warner Discovery now. But at any rate, you have companies that competed with each other previously that are allowed to come together. That's called a horizontal merger. And the federal government will look at that with a jaundiced eye. Why would the federal government give scrutiny to a horizontal merger more than other kind of mergers? What do you think? Because it decreases what? Decreases competition, right? So the idea is, if you have a horizontal merger, when Exxon Mobil came together, okay, or when Heinz purchased Kraft, okay, ultimately there's less selection for the consumer. Like, for instance, toothpaste. I mean, we could go on and on about this. You go in a grocery store and you see all these brands, okay? But if you peel the layers back a little bit, you find out, like with toothpaste, there's only two major companies. There's Crest and Colgate. Those are the only two, really. I mean, they're not the only, but they're the two big players. It's like a duopoly. Each one will have different brands, if you will, that they'll put on the shelf, and it looks like you have a huge selection. But behind it all, there's really only two companies. You get into meat packing, you got the same thing. There's maybe you go down the meat aisle at the grocery store, you may see lots of what you think is variety, but when you look behind who's doing the packing, there's only one or two companies and so forth. So there's lots of instances where we've allowed competitors to come together and we don't even see it, okay? Sunglasses is another one, okay? There aren't, there's these little shops, I can't even think of the names of them, I should have looked this up, but ultimately a lot of your sunglasses are made by one manufacturer. You would think not, okay? But there is a high degree of concentration when you talk about the industry that manufactures sunglasses and so forth. You just see these different labels out there. I say you see all these labels, but there's not really all that much competition when you get down to it. Well, the federal government will, again, scrutinize a horizontal merger. You have they have a way of challenging that by looking at the Herfindahl Index. We computed the Herfindahl Index in chapter 11 or so back there. Go back and look at that Herfindahl Index where you take the market shares of the particular companies that may come together, you take their market shares, you square them, and you add up the sum, you sum the squares over all the competitors in an industry, squares of their market share. Remember that? And if that Herfindahl Index moves very much, I think your book says that the federal government is likely to challenge a horizontal merger if the post-merger Herfindahl index is initially above 1,800 and has increased by 100 points or more after the merger. So remember, we calculated the HI for a monopoly. What would be the HI for a monopoly? Be 100%. One firm has 100%, and you square that, so it's 10,000. That's the highest that the Herfindahl index can be. So if you have a monopoly, the Herfindahl index is 10,000. If you have perfect competition, the other extreme there, a whole bunch of suppliers that are very little, then you're adding up a bunch of square zeros. So the lowest the Herfindahl index can be is 0. Okay, so the higher the Herfindahl index, the more concentrated the industry. And so they're saying, first off, the federal government, basically the Justice Department, will challenge a horizontal merger only if, first, the Herfindahl index in that industry is 1,800. So first off, there's got to be a certain degree of industry concentration. And then if after the merger, the Herfindahl index moves by 100 points, it's going to go up, right, if you have two firms coming together. So that's kind of the threshold, if you will. It's just been a long-standing guideline for calling forth intervention by the federal government in horizontal mergers, is where is the Herfindahl index initially and what's going to happen to it in the course of the merger. Okay, so, but at any rate, horizontal mergers present the consumer with fewer possibilities, fewer alternatives, and so that can be alarming to the federal government. So they'll look at that number. Now, vertical mergers, that's a different thing. Vertical mergers are almost always considered to be good things. The federal government's not really going to challenge, certainly not a conglomerate merger, but also a vertical merger. Now, the petroleum industry, there's a whole history of upstream and downstream components in the petroleum industry coming together and going apart. So you used to have ConocoPhillips, and then you have Phillips 66 that was spun off. And they're more into distribution and so forth. But when you have vertical mergers, like when Pepsi purchased Yum Brands, you know that? Now they don't anymore, but they used to own like Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken. PepsiCo used to own those firms. Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and some others. That was kind of a vertical merger, and the federal government really never challenged that. Obviously, Pepsi wanted to do that because they want to get their product in front of you, right? So if you like chicken, you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, you got to have a Pepsi. Can't get a Coke, it's not there. So you fill up with Pepsi. Hey, that's pretty good. So they supplied to these other restaurants, which were called, and I think they're still called Yum Brands today. And you can Google that. Google Yum Brands and find some others. But that's considered to be a good thing. Those vertical mergers are considered to be good things. Why is that? Because you eliminate the middleman, okay? And you have cost efficiencies that the company can enjoy when it comes together. And so you got the same company that pumps the oil, crude oil out of the ground, that ships the crude oil to the refinery, that refines the crude oil into these distillates that we like to use, and those distillates are sold at the gas station and so forth. So you may have a company that owns all those different stages of production, and so ultimately that can be a good thing for the consumer because they're putting that gasoline in your tank at a lower price than otherwise could be achieved. So vertical mergers are considered by the federal government generally to be good things, whereas and conglomerates, whereas horizontal mergers are typically challenged. Your book talks about some egregious examples of price fixing, which is a per se violation of the Sherman Act. Again, just if it happens, if price fixing happens, it's illegal. Nobody says, how bad was it? Okay, thank you. If it happens, it's illegal. It's a per se violation. I like this. Your book talks about Star-Kissed tuna, which is kind of a famous thing in 2018. Star-Kissed and Bumblebee were successfully prosecuted, if you will, for price fixing, or for price fixing tuna. Also in 2013, another example, kind of a notable example of price fixing was Apple Computer, okay, was engaged with several publishers. I know Penguin was one of them, I like their books, but I think there's a list of them here in your text, for fixing the price of ebooks, okay? And so they got together. Apple was in the center of that. And so the federal government was able to fine Apple $450 million. Pretty significant, right? For this anti-competitive behavior. Okay, so we've been talking about antitrust legislation, antitrust behavior. The last thing I'd like for us to think about a little bit is something called industrial regulation. How do you regulate monopolies that we basically de facto consider to be an okay thing to have in our culture? For instance, the gas company, the electric company, and so forth. Public utilities, that we figure the only way public utilities really can deliver a service to your house is by allowing monopoly power. So we don't try to break up your gas company, the company that delivers natural gas to your house. ONG is a monopoly, kind of basically speaking. OG&E, Oklahoma Gas and Electric, is a monopoly. So these are monopolies. If they wanted to, they could engage in monopoly pricing. We've talked about monopolies, how monopolies will equate marginal costs and marginal revenue and charge monopoly prices, okay? But we don't allow that because our electric bills would be a lot higher. So when it comes to natural monopolies, and that's what public utilities are, we try to simply to regulate them. We never try to break them up. We simply try to regulate them. And we have looked at this just a little bit before when we talked about public utilities. I just want to make mention of this diagram we had on page 241 of your text. If we, I think I got 2 minutes left, and this was in chapter 11, and we were looking here with this diagram here at a natural monopoly. Okay, a couple things is this is a firm with a downward sloping individual demand curve, and the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. You know it's a monopoly, right? Because, I mean, it could be a monopolistic competition, but this is monopoly with this picture here. And it has a downward sloping average total cost curve. That there tells you it's a natural monopoly. That is, bigger means more efficient. So this actually is a picture that really applies to a public utility company very well. Public utility companies are natural monopolies. This is the situation confronting a public utility company. Now, as a monopoly, it wants to equate marginal revenue and marginal cost, okay, and charge a price way up here on the demand curve. But of course, what you have then is decreased output because society wants to be here, okay? But, I'm sorry, I'm looking in the screen. Here we go, the socially optimal price where the supply and demand curve intersect. Really, monopolies don't have a supply curve, but the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. Notice we're producing much less than what society wants. So monopolies tend to produce little and charge a high price. But regulatory boards, like in in the state of Oklahoma, we have the Corporation Commission that OG&E and ONG have to go before they get a rate increase and so forth, are constrained to charge a lower price. So generally speaking, we kind of choose between these two regions right here. And I wished I had time today. It looks like we're running out of time here a little bit. But society doesn't get its way in charging a low price where the marginal cost, the supply and demand curves intersect. I'm calling this the supply curve. It's really for a monopolist, it's just marginal cost curve. This is where society wants to be. But the monopolist is not earning a profit until the price can rise to here and earn a fair return. So next time we'll talk about how regulatory boards will select a price in this region.